Thank you. Even as a young student, graduate student, I had a problem with some ideas about Greek historiography, and especially the concept that the modern Greek state forms a sudden break from the Ottoman past. And that was what led me about 20 years ago to go to Leslie's office and ask her to be my advisor in my dissertation, which eventually, to show you how great an influence she was about women and property and the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the modern Greek state. Similarly, I have an issue with the way Greek historiography sees the role of minorities, especially in the 19th century. And although some work has been done recently in the past couple decades with regards to the 20th century and Jewish and Muslim minorities and their role in the Greek state, including work by Catherine Fleming, who was here earlier, the same has not been done for the 19th century. And this was my second project, a book project, dealing with the Jewish communities of Greece in the 19th century. So what I'm going to talk here today is expanding that second project a little bit to consider a brief aspect of Muslims in Greece in the 19th century and their role in the modern Greek state. Now, of course, the modern Greek state emerges from the Greek War of Independence, which was a particularly vicious conflict, a sectarian conflict that the contemporary British historian George Finlay called a war of extermination on both sides, that pitted Orthodox Christians against Muslims and Jews in a very vicious battle that saw regular massacres from both sides. Now, what is perhaps less known is that a lot of the Muslims and Jews in Greece were not, in fact, massacred or fled the Greek territories, in part because they lived in cities that were never conquered by the Greek rebels. And therefore, Greeks, even at the time of the drafting of the first constitutions in 1822 and 1823 and 1827, were quite aware that the state that they were going to emerge with would have minorities. And that was taken into consideration. And in the first instances, the first constitutions, Muslims and Jews were deliberately excluded by linking citizenship to the membership to the Orthodox Church. Now, this exclusion at the time was applauded even by liberal figures in Greece and in Europe, such as Adamadios Korais, perhaps the most famous Greek intellectual in Europe at the time, who found it quite proper to exclude Muslims and Jews from full participation in the modern Greek state, because at the moment, and those are his words, they constituted different races, different nations, as opposed to different races. He saw them as belonging to the same race, but being hostile nations because of the war. For Korais, there needed a time. There was a time required for the Muslims and the Jews to gain a Greek identity, which would be done through the Greek schooling system, public schooling system, that in a generation would allow Muslims and Jews to assume full civil rights alongside the Greeks. And in this, he was echoed by European liberals like Jeremy Bentham, who also insisted that Muslims and Jews should be excluded from full participation, especially from voting in the new Greek state, until such a time when their vote would not be sectarian. Now, the physical destruction of most of the Muslim and Jewish communities in Greece between 1821 and 1827 reduced, if you want, the necessity, the immediacy of the exclusion of such groups. So the Constitution of 1827 actually allowed the possibility for non-Christians to become citizens of the Greek state. And the conservative royalist constitution, in quotation marks, that brought the first Greek monarchy of the Bavarian Prince Otto in Greece in 1830, actually has no mention of Christianity as a requirement for being a citizen. The only membership of necessity of Christianity was for the monarch, who had to be an Orthodox Christian after the first ruler, who happened to be Catholic, of course. Beyond that, there were no prohibitions to Muslims or Jews from assuming any post or office in the modern Greek state. And that is, in fact, the legal standing of minorities in Greece throughout the 19th century. They could achieve any position within the Greek state. And in fact, we have examples in 1881 when Thessaly, which is a much larger Muslim community existed, when it was incorporated into the Greek state, several Muslims were elected as members of parliament in 1822 and 1823. Now, the legal structures of the new state, however, is a different process, right? Once the modern Greek state emerges, there is a deliberate attempt to eradicate the Ottoman institutions, which effectively were eradicated by a 10-year war between 1821 and 1830, and to implement modern European models, especially a centralized hierarchical judicial system. Now, when the King Otto arrives, he's also accompanied by a regency because he's only 15. And one of those regents is a very prominent legal scholar, Georg Ludwig von Maurer, who sets about in a very short order to create the modern Greek system, judicial system. And within 3 years, he produces a new penal code based on the Bavarian one. He produces a new commercial code based on the French one. He produces a code of civil jurisprudence, but does not produce a civil code. The reason he does not do that is because Maurer has the belief that customary law, the existing customaries of Greece, constitute a living law that has to be respected. And as a result, he wants to craft a civil code based upon those customary practices. This is a debate that is ongoing in Europe at the time. There are different groups, some who support, for example, the adoption of the newly Napoleonic Code that had actually a lot of followers throughout Europe, and others, especially in Germany, who believe in a historical process of law and would like to implement a civil code, a unified civil code based upon common practices. The latter is it's a tremendous task. You have to somehow make very different customs somehow work with each other. And to show you how difficult it is, in Greece, we do not get a unified civil code until 1946, a century later. Right. In the meantime, the Greek courts are directed to respect local customs. What that means is that any plaintiff who brings a case to the Greek courts regarding civil matters has to first prove the law, has to prove what custom exists in their particular village, island, province, whatever you have. And based upon what they prove as law, the court will rule on their specific case. What that means is that the Greek legal system is also willing to accept foreign laws that have no impact on Greece at all. For example, the Napoleonic Code, which was explicitly rejected as a basis for the civil code in Greece, but which is accepted in the courts for foreigners. So if a French citizen brings a court case in the Greek court, let's say against his wife or against for inheritance and so on, their customary law is the Napoleonic Code. And that is how they proceed. In that sense, Islamic law finds its way into the Greek civil courts because that is recognized as the customary law of Muslims, of the Muslim community in Greece. And at the time, there is such a community on Euboea, the Negroponte, as it was often called at the time, which survived the Greek War of Independence. And therefore, they were able to bring lawsuits in the Greek courts based upon Islamic law. I'm not claiming here that they had, in fact, judicial autonomy. Quite the opposite. There are no qadis. There's no Islamic judges. They have to bring this court to the Greek civil courts, and the Greek civil courts will base their decision upon Islamic law. So how did that process work? And I'm going to be using here the examples regarding primarily conversion. because that impacted a lot of the women at the time, but also because that is the most common cause where we see Islamic law appear in the Greek courts. Now, and here I'm talking about conversion of Muslims into Christian Orthodox. And the majority of those were, of course, women and children who had been converted during the Greek War of Independence. When we have the capture of cities during that war by the Greek insurgents, very often the Muslim population was massacred, but many thousands of women and children were actually spared in those massacres. Instead, these women and children were often given to local notables to work as servants in their house or in their fields, and the vast majority of these women and children eventually converted to Christianity. After the conclusion of the Greek War of Independence, many surviving members of their families, fathers, husbands, mothers, and so on, sought to reclaim their children or their spouses who had converted to Christianity, and came to Greece and lodged cases against whoever was holding or was responsible for the children. So we have a number of these circumstances where these individuals find themselves in court, often because they had been converted when they were in the age of 2 or 3, and 10 years later, somebody they do not know comes to claim them as the rightful father or mother. More problematic, however, than that even, were older women who had converted to Christianity and who had, according to Greek law, inherited the properties of their parents, who had often been massacred in the process of the capture of those cities. Family members from outside of Greece in the Ottoman Empire would lodge law cases against these women in order to claim that they should have been disinherited as apostates from Islam. And the Greek courts and the Greek state was in a very difficult position about how to deal with such cases. In fact, the Greek state created a permanent commission in order to deal with all these cases of converted women whose family members were claiming that they illegally possessed the inheritance from their parents. The permanent committee, which was established to deal with these properties, recognized that, according to the law, they should have been disinherited. In fact, they mentioned that the various relatives brought statements from, they call them Ottoman documents, I think they mean here fatwas, claiming that apostates from Islam are disinherited, female apostates from Islam are disinherited. But they were reluctant to recognize those claims because that would mean that these women would be rendered destitute in the Greek state. Furthermore, and this is specifically claimed in the documents, the committee is afraid that many of these women who had married had only managed to marry because of their wealth. And if the state removed that wealth from them, their husbands would divorce them, and therefore they would become destitute and a burden upon the state. So the committee was very reluctant to honor what they recognized to be the actual validity of the case that the various family members were bringing in. This legal process, this legal conflict, continues for almost a generation. The last document I have of a similar case involves a woman called Efthymia Douni, a convert, whose relatives brought a case in 1860 in order to reclaim the property of her deceased father because she had converted to Christianity. The Muslim relatives brought the case in the Greek court. The court found in their favor. She appealed. It went to the Appeals Court of Athens. And the Appeal Court of Athens, unlike the courts of the 1830s, ruled that because during the Ottoman period, apostasy from Islam would have been impossible, the exclusion of apostates from inheritance did not constitute an actual custom because it failed to meet the long duration and continuous duration that the law said customs should have in order to be recognized by the Greek courts. So in fact, they reversed the decision of the earlier court and allowed Duni to retain her properties, her father's properties, in her possession. What is interesting in the case of the Supreme Court is that unlike the earlier courts, they did not seek the advice of Muslim authorities in the Ottoman Empire. Up to that point, in the 1830s at least, most of these cases seek out guidance from the Sheikhul Islam in Istanbul. And that also we see in one other case of conversion, and I was notified that I have to wrap up, that involves a woman called Aize, who later appears in the documents as Marigo Maria, who in 1855, when her parents were trying to emigrate from Greece to the Ottoman Empire, fled her parents and sought refuge to a Christian home where she converted. Her parents and the Ottoman authorities objected to her conversion, and the court ended up again being involved in this case. This was in 1855, but in this case, the Greek court case, sought the advice of the Sheikhul Islam regarding the majority, what Islamic law determines as the majority of women, in order to determine whether she was of age to make the decision to convert to Christianity. So what I want to mention with this cases is the willingness of the Greek legal system to incorporate Islamic law within a modern European legal system and seek guidance not only from local Muslims, but also from what was, with all accounts, a hostile force, the Ottoman Empire, from which they had just broken off, by seeking the advice of the Sheikhul Islam about what constituted proper Islamic law. Thank you.
Okay, hello. Thank you for inviting me, Leslie, and thank you for having me here. This talks so far have been very, very interesting. So today I want to talk about gender norms and print technologies in 19th century Istanbul. Sources depicting the gender world of pre-modern Istanbul, as many of you know, centrally often feature the character of the boy beloved, right? The boy beloved is a young, beautiful, witty, and refined boy, usually coming from a modest background, and within high society of pre-modern Istanbul, a universal object of desire. He stands for a number of things connected to sexuality and desire. He stands for intergenerational desire. As you can see here in the first two pictures, he is depicted together with older men and an older lady in the second one. He stands for same-sex desire. He is pursued by older men, but also by so-called levens, which are hyper-masculine young men of his own generation. You can see the boy beloved with levens in the picture to the far right. He stands for sex as commodity. He barters his sexual favors for status and wealth, and this is done in a very open and unjudgmental way within the society. And he stands for sex as openly discussed, because we have a wealth of sources involving the boy beloved where sex is very, very explicitly described and thematized. All these things, all these issues become deeply problematic with the introduction and discussion of Western gender norms in Istanbul society in the 19th century. And Ottoman views on gender change, or at least pretend to change. As we see from this quote from the Maruzat of Ahmet Cevdet Pasha, written in the late 19th century, Ahmet Cevdet Pasha claims that women lovers multiplied in the 19th century in Istanbul, while boy belovers decreased in number. The people of Lot were seemingly swallowed by the earth. The love and inclination towards young men, which had been a famous and habitual part of Istanbul life, was transferred to girls, as should be the case by nature. Okay, so this very Western idea of the natural inclination towards this or towards that. Today's scholarship does not subscribe to this view of this very sudden, abrupt change in Istanbul society, but it does still subscribe to the idea of a gradual change. Maybe it wasn't sudden, it is said, but throughout the 19th century, slowly, these pre-modern gender norms made way and were replaced by Western understanding, more Western understanding of gender norms. The endpoints that Ahmet Cevdet Pasha envisions and that modern scholarship envisions are not so far apart from each other. And I want to question today a little bit, firstly, the monolithic character of this assumed change. I mean, society changed, society as a whole changed, society changed over time in a specific direction. And secondly, the completedness, the completion of this change, that we reach an endpoint where this change has taken place and where one set of sort of one gender worldview has been replaced by another one. In order to question this, I'm going to draw, let's see, here, good. So I'm going to draw on a very small sample group of sources, namely the Tiflis stories published in the 19th century. The Tiflis stories are a genre of Ottoman lowbrow popular prose fiction. They are urban adventures set in Istanbul and featuring local settings and local characters, and gender relations play a prominent role in the Tiflis stories. In the 19th century, we have 8 known Tiflis stories. You can see all of them here on the slide right now, published between 1851 and 1884. The stories are not merely generically similar to each other. Some of them are actually different versions of the same story, which makes them especially interesting for comparative analysis across stories and across time. And not only that, but also we can make a very, very interesting comparison here because, as you can see on this page, we have different print technologies involved in the printing of the Tiflis stories. We have on the one hand, to the left, you can see we have the print technique of lithography, employed to reproduce certain or print certain Tiflis stories. And on the other hand, we have the print technique of movable type. In the 19th century, we actually have 4 Tiflis stories that were reproduced as lithography. You can see them to the left, all of them. The 3rd and the 4th story are within the same document. And to the right, you can see there are 4 stories that were published as movable type. And the dates tell you that there is no progression, no clear progression from one technology to the other. Rather, they're mixed. Like, you know, the one technology is not employed before the other. To talk briefly about these two print technologies. Lithography was interesting to the Ottomans because it actually enabled them, as you can see in this example, to stage a formal continuation of the manuscript tradition of the written word, not simply to convey a piece of information, but also the written word as a form of art. So the technique of lithography was a kind of compromise between mass production for sale of books and preserving the sort of artistic nature of book production. But also at the same time, it wasn't just a formal continuity to manuscript culture, but also in many ways a continuity in terms of content, because we have many, many lithography stories, lithography books that are simply reproductions of manuscripts that already existed, that feature the exact same text that you would have found in a pre-modern manuscript. On the other hand, you have the movable type stories, which the movable type kind of book, where you see the artistic intent has kind of been abandoned, but this sort of technology really established itself and pushed lithography aside from the 1860s onwards, because this is when the Ottomans started publishing their first private newspapers. And newspapers are, of course, are printed too often and with too much different content to be able to enable them to be printed through lithography. So gradually, movable type replaced lithography. Many printing presses retooled themselves to use movable type because this was just what customers were demanding. But it wasn't just a formal difference. It was also a difference in content, because the newspapers were published mostly by reform-minded Ottoman intellectuals, people who wanted to give messages of who wanted to convey modern Western ideas, or sort of their interpretation of modern Western ideas to Ottoman society. So in many ways, you can say that the medium became the message. If an educated Ottoman person were to walk across stalls where lithography and movable type books were being sold, they would have known just by the appearance of the book, right? They wouldn't have had really to look into the book to know, okay, this is the kind of book that I'm interested in as a sort of contemporary Ottoman intellectual. They would have probably dismissed the lithography book out of hand. They wouldn't even have had to look at individual lithography books in order to know this is not the kind of these kinds of books do not explore the kinds of ideas that I'm interested in. Kind of like preferences between different musical genres today that people might have, and dismiss certain musical genres out of hand without having listened to specific examples of them. So as to be expected from what I said, in the lithography stories of the 19th century, we really still find the pre-modern gender world of the Ottoman Empire that I outlined at the beginning in force. And that doesn't really change whether the lithography story was published at the beginning of the 19th century or in the middle or in the end. It still kind of preserves that old pre-modern gender world. In contrast, we do find very interesting and gradual changes in the in gender norms, gender understandings when we look at movable type stories. So in movable type stories, we see, especially when we compare versions of the same story that we have as lithography and as movable type, certain things disappearing. For example, explicit sex. You can see that in the movable type story, in the lithography story to the left, this is the same story as the second one that you see next to it, and you can see I've written under it that the sexual content of the story does not feature in the movable type version. And keep in mind that this is not just a historical progression, right? It is not a historical progression, because the lithography story here in this case was actually published after the movable type. So we can't simply say over time it changed, right? We have to talk about parallel discourses happening at the same time. And to the left, you see another example of two stories that are versions of the same material, and you can see that in the movable type version, the explicit sex has been removed, same-sex references have been removed, intergenerational desire references have been removed, even the figure of the boy beloved himself has been removed from this story, right? So really, you can see that with the movable type stories, we go away, we move away from intergenerational desire, we move away from same-sex desire, from explicit sex, and from boy beloveds themselves even. We start to move away from all of these things. Instead of them, the movable type stories introduce a new player in the field of desire, namely a figure of a young girl, a young, unmarried, free Muslim girl into these stories to replace, to find a new way of conceiving desire as plotted between a young man and a young woman of the same generation. So we have one story, Hikaye Cevri Çelebi, published in 1872-73, which features a love triangle between a boy beloved, a Levant, and a free girl, where the Levant and the free girl are competing for the affection of the boy beloved, and the girl ends up with the boy beloved, not the Levant. And in the last story published in the 19th century, İki Biraderler Hikayesi, we don't even have a boy beloved anymore. We have just three Levants competing over a free girl. So at the end of the 19th century, we've arrived at this idea of the Levant as a stand-in for sort of the Western desiring young male, and a free girl to oppose him in this sort of in this sort of play of desire. But the free girl, I mean, the Levant kind of works; it sort of makes sense. But the free girl creates deep problems for Ottoman authors and for sort of authors trying to conceive of this Western kind of desire in Ottoman terms. The big problem is, how can this girl be available to desire and morally and preserve her moral integrity at the same time? How can she be available and moral at the same time? Earlier stories avoid this kind of thing. They don't have the free girl, but for instance, they have prostitutes available for desire. Those are immoral by definition. Or they have slave girls available to desire, and slaves do not have in this world view context, they do not have their free moral will. So the question of morality is moot with slave girls as well. With a free girl, we have a problem. How do we conceive of her as a sexual player, as a player in the field of desire, and keep her moral at the same time? In the Hikaye Cevri Çelebi, the free girl functions kind of, she takes on the attributes of an older pursuer of the boy beloved in earlier stories. So she kind of manipulates the situation. She gets the boy beloved to be with her, etc., etc. She mobilizes resources like servants, and she takes the boy beloved to her summer home, etc., etc. So she behaves as if she was an older pursuer in an older. So the attributes of the older pursuer have been superimposed onto this free girl in order to render her a player in this kind of story. But at the end of the story, while older pursuers usually get penalized or punished for their behavior, the free girl is kind of exonerated by the Sultan stepping in and saying, well, okay, you guys really fit together very well. I should actually marry you, and forget about the immorality of what you did. So the immorality is kind of rendered moot by the Sultan stepping in and saying, okay, you guys are good together, so I'm just going to endorse this, okay? Even though other characters in the story do comment on the girl's immorality. The last story, İki Biraderler Hikayesi, spins it a different way. The girl encounters 3 different Levants in the course of the story, but she doesn't encounter them out of her own free will. She is kind of forced into situations where she encounters them. In the first one she encounters is through her aunt, who basically tricks her into believing there is a good marriage prospect, and he takes her to the villa of a Levant who is actually only interested in sexually abusing her. She flees, trying to preserve her morality. And while fleeing, she bumps into the second Levant. Oh, so she's not running to him out of desire, but she's actually trying to escape somebody else's desire. And she bumps into the second guy who acts like a savior for her and takes her home to basically save her. At home, his roommate automatically assumes, well, this is a girl who's coming home with my roommate, so she must be immoral, she must be a prostitute. He tries to sort of sexually, he acts as a sexual aggressor, and the second Levant who brought her home, in order to defend her, kills the third guy. So she encounters 3 guys, but in all of these cases, she is not the active pursuer, she is not a desirer, and therefore the story has, through these somersaults, through this convoluted and hardly believable storyline, created a situation where she can interact with men without therefore being immoral, right? So for me, this shows, and these are both movable type stories, right? So these are stories that actually operate within a medium of reform, within a medium in which this kind of reform is being pushed. Western ideas are being pushed. Even within such a medium, right? What this shows me is that authors could not simply say, well, okay, I'm going to take a Western type of story. I want to bring across a new kind of relationship, a Western type relationship between a young man and a young woman. And so I'm just going to take a Western story. I'm going to change the names. I'm going to make it so as if it was set in our city. Even reform-minded authors have to draw on their own toolkit of sort of social sexual roles that are available to them from their own traditional society to try to make this new kind of relationship work. And it's not a done deal, even by the end of the 19th century, even in the hands of authors who are interested in pushing a reform agenda, in pushing a sort of agenda of westernization. It's not a done deal. You end up with a sort of a young man, a Levant figure who can act as a kind of model for a young Western man in some way, but the character of the girl presents this deep and continues to present this deep paradox between availability for desire on the one hand and moral integrity on the other. And that remains a paradox that the stories, even the most reform-minded stories, struggle to resolve. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I have to give you this microphone, if I can get it out. Okay, maybe I can't. Just do this one. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll give you the microphone and then we'll pass it along. This needs to be done for recording purposes, in case you weren't here earlier. So does anyone have any questions or comments from these great papers? Okay.
Those were all wonderful papers. Thank you very much. I have a question about Greece. Well, I have several questions, actually. I'll do them really quickly. The thing about the Shaykhul Islam, that really just reminded me of the problems modern countries have, like England, in deciding what is Islamic law for cases that involve that. And, you know, the modern countries haven't come to a good conclusion about that, about what to do. The questions I had were, there seems to be a kind of clash of jurisdictions here, and how do they resolve it? If it's a Muslim and a Christian, whose law decides the case? If it's a Muslim defendant and a Christian plaintiff. And the other question I had was about, as I understand it, today, still in Thessaly, there's a kind of Islamic law system for the Muslim minority. So how does the system you're talking about in the 19th century become a system that has a civil code, but also then has a minority provision for different kind of law?
Can I just pile on, because I have another question in the same vein, and maybe you can just answer all of them at the same. The 1860 case, in which they basically say, oh, well, that's not custom. So the question is, what is custom, and how is that determined? I mean, it's reasonable that there should be a way to decide what custom is, because anyone can just bring in and say, well, my custom is that, you know, you rule in my favor. So, but so how do they figure out what custom is?
Okay, so I'll start with reverse order then. Custom is defined exactly as the court said it at the beginning. In order to prove that something was a custom, it has to have a long duration and to be without a break, that duration. So you should be able to prove that this is what we've been doing for, you know, centuries or as far as we can remember, basically. That was the idea. In order to prove that, you bring notables or elders in order to prove that idea. Now, the court is assuming here that you cannot apostatize from Islam before the establishment of the modern Greek state. Therefore, it's not a long duration. That custom did not exist during the Ottoman period. Therefore, it's not a custom. That is the rationale that they're using it. I'm not saying if it's correct. That's how they explain it in their own statement. Now, regarding what's happening now, after 1923, the system changes dramatically with the exchange of populations and so on. Muslim communities do get some judicial autonomy. So you have qadis now in Greece, not only in Thessaly, but also in Thrace and other parts, where they can function as Islamic judges. They can still apply to the Greek courts almost as, if they're not satisfied with the decision of the qadi, there are cases where then they go to the Greek courts in order to trump those decisions. Kind of the same way as if Christians were using in the Ottoman Empire when they went to the ecclesiastical courts, and if they didn't like the decision, they went to the qadi courts in order to trump that. It's the opposite now happening in Greece. But up until late 1923, there were no qadis functioning in Greece. That happens with the exchange of populations, sometime between that period when they do receive heightened, if you want, degrees of autonomy. Now, regarding your first question, this is a complex issue. And Devinar from Washington University is actually looking at that in the 20th century. And what he's claiming is that, in fact, in Greece, marriage between two different religions is impossible. It's legally impossible. Somebody has to convert. So in many of these instances, you would not have, for example, a divorce or something like that. You would not have two people married in order to have a question of whose law supersedes the other. With regards to other cases, penal matters, of course, there's a penal code. Commercial matters, there is a commercial code. So there are very few instances where you would have an issue in civil litigation that you would have that problem. And also another thing to keep in mind is the Muslim minority at the time I'm talking is tiny and diminishing as time goes by. By the 1860s, there are almost no Muslims left in Greece because they have immigrated to the Ottoman Empire.
So I also have a question about Greece. So my question, this is what I'm thinking as I'm listening to you deliver this talk, and tell me if this is also how you understand it. This sounds to me like a nationalization of the logic of the consular courts. So if you see how the consular, say British consular courts work in the 1860s and 70s, that's exactly how they deal with subjects coming from different parts of the empire. So Muslim Indian merchants would go into the consular court because they have a dispute, and the consular court would say, okay, so your law is the Sharia, this is our understanding of the Sharia, and they follow this. And what's ironic in the 1870s is that when they go to the Ottoman legal system, it's already a Nizami legal system that follows a different kind of codified law. And in fact, I've come across a case also about legal majority in which the British consular court says, oh, in Sharia, majority is determined based on kind of the discretion of the judge. And while the Nizami court had set a numerical kind of age, and it says this is the age of majority, and so there is a disagreement over whether the person in question is a legal major or minor. So yeah.
I agree, it looks very much like it, but I don't think that was in their minds when they were drafting the code. These are Germans, right? So their experience is actually Bavaria. So their idea is to create courts based upon the German legal debates with customary law. And it so happens that actually it fits very well so that we can accommodate Jews and we can accommodate Muslims and we can accommodate foreigners, and there's a lot of foreigners in Greece at the time as well. With regards to the majority, I agree with you, but I also have a feeling that in this case, they're trying to be a little bit cute in the idea that there is a legal age of majority in Greece, which would have made this woman not able to convert. But she has already converted, she's married somebody already, so they're trying to find an out, and they're thinking that the Muslim age of majority would be lower, and therefore they can get out of this problem. Because it has become a political problem by this time. The British consul is involved, the French consul is involved, the Ottoman authorities are involved, so it is a problem that the Greek government wants to get rid of somehow.
This is a question for David. I'm wondering, do you find any precedent for the introduction of this female character, perhaps in, say, folk stories? Is there any indigenous precedent that is shaping somehow the way that this female character is introduced and the trials and tribulations that make her remain blameless?
Okay, so it's a very good question. And there's an interesting answer in that usually this kind of story, the Tiflis stories and stories that are similar, like these urban, sort of proto-realistic urban adventure stories, don't really draw on folk material that much. They have their own sort of oral urban storytelling tradition to fall back on, like the Meddah tradition, right? They draw a lot of inspiration from that. But what's interesting is that once this girl enters the picture, and the whole question of how do we get her to interact with guys, how do we get guys interested in her, how do they notice her, how does she notice them, the authors start trying out all these different sort of experimental ways of making that happen. And one of them is actually, in the first story that features a girl that I mentioned, the Djevichelebi story, there is actually from folk tales incorporated the figure of falling in love with a picture of someone, right? So that this kind of idea that you would normally not find in the urban kind of story, but in a sort of more folkloristic, in a more rural kind of story, that the lovers sort of who represent sort of a mystical, who stand for a kind of mystical quest of reunion between the soul and God, fall in love with each other not by seeing each other, but by seeing each other's picture, right? And that is actually a device that story imports in order to establish the first connection between the girl and the boy, because how else would they? That's just something that they put in there in order to make these two characters notice each other. So very creatively, they avail themselves of this device in order to make the first connection happen.
David, this was very, very interesting. And a question to you, a connection with the female character. Would you agree with the statement that in the introduction of this free girl, is it like a moralizing element?
And what do you mean?
Into the disciplining the men? And I'm kind of like imposing my own ideas, so you're free to...
Actually, also in older stories, you have the disciplining of the men. Even in stories where you have same-sex desire, or like desire between a levant and a young boy, a mahbub, or between an older man and a mahbub. At the end of the story, usually the male participants in the desire sort of dance are married off to somebody. So there is this kind of like, Leslie talks about these ages as liminal states. She says, well, this is a time when the sexuality, the kind of untamed sexuality of this age group presents a danger to the social order, and the social order is reestablished by getting these guys married, right? So you do have the disciplining of the male desire, even in older stories, where it's very clear that the marriage is not connected to any kind of love or to any kind of affection or whatever, but it's just about kind of fixing the social status of these individuals within that particular social order. What happens with the introduction of the girl as a player in the stories actually an opening of a can of worms, if you will, that really sort of makes the whole question of disciplining extremely difficult to sort of grasp and to handle because of the dilemma that I talked about between the availability and the morality of the girl that exists. And you could argue that in creating this girl, actually, in creating this girl with this intrinsic dilemma, these authors are creating the first modern character in Ottoman fiction, because until then, I mean, with each character that you have in this kind of story, you actually know where they should be going. You actually know how the conflict should be resolved. But with this girl, for the first time, you don't know. Like, even at the end of the story, it's unclear how this conflict between availability and morality should be resolved. So it actually complicates the issue of discipline in a very interesting way.
That's very interesting. One more question.
Sure.
It's about, so you have examples from 1950s into the late 19th century.
Yeah.
I wonder if you see any transformation, change in the vocabulary. A, how graphic these stories are, and second, do you see any sort of like a new vocabulary coming in, and if so, what would be the implication of that?
The language definitely changes. I mean, part of the change has to do with the tabooization of sex that I talked about, right? I mean, in the lithography stories, we really do have. And again, when I say change, please keep in mind it's very easy to fall into the mistake of regarding one set of stories as chronologically previous to the other. It's not the case. Both of the things are happening at the same time. Both discourses are being pushed at the same time. That's really, that's something that I'm emphasizing it because I fell into that mistake a lot when I was first analyzing these stories, of thinking, okay, there's some kind of gradual change going on here. No. So the language varies, let's put it that way. In the lithography stories, you have very explicit depiction of sex, like sometimes for laughs, right, where body parts are described as being ugly, but the bearer of them is not aware of that. He or she thinks they are very beautiful, but actually they're very ugly. That kind of sort of comic effect. Sometimes it's for titillation, where it's like really sort of pornographic, where it sort of describes this desire in a way that's meant to arouse you, but it's there, right? And also in, for example, in the vocabulary that the characters use when they're talking with each other, like cursing, right? Sort of explicit curse words. This kind of stuff, if you compare versions, if you compare lithography and movable type versions of the same stories, that kind of stuff gets censored out. That kind of stuff gets sort of removed when you look at the movable type stories, which. Yeah, I mean, so language changes in terms of the taboo, what is taboo and what's not. But also what changes is, of course, the development in the movable type stories of a language, of a new kind of language, which Walter Ong would have called a grapholect, like a sort of new, sort of centrally kind of controlled literary language that pushes a sort of compromise between the vernacular and the high language, right? Whereas in the lithography stories, what you usually find is a sort of very down-to-earth language. I mean, if it's supposed to be high language, it's high language. If it's supposed to be mundane language, it's very mundane language. Whereas in the movable type stories, you see them straining towards a sort of unified sort of literary language for Ottoman literature.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you all. I have a question for Aviv. Can you tell us a little bit about how these shifts in credit and fiscal systems look like or affect the grain producers themselves? Right? How they look from the perspective of the peasant cultivators, right, who are at the other end of the taxation systems and the credit systems.
Yes. There's actually a very interesting point to make here, which is the fact that in this period, the Ottoman officials tend to use this language or this against these Christian and Jewish financiers, and we see also consuls using this discourse of peasant indebtedness and how these elites are pre-modern usurers exploiting the peasantry and so on and so forth. But at the same time, starting in the 50s, even 40s, from the 40s until the 70s, we see this legislation that is being promoted and is gradually favorable towards all kinds of different forms of mortgage and land-based credit instruments that, in effect, very often lead to the dispossession of peasants. So I think this puts the specifically this protege elite in a very interesting position, because on the one hand they can and they do use their European protection in various legal cases to advance debt repayments, but on the other hand, you see that how Europeans are the consuls, sometimes even those who specifically have very strong relationships with these proteges. They are their proteges, who are trying to also, while they vilify these usurers or these moneylenders all the time, they also try to subsume or to take over their business. So in a way, there's a very interesting move towards legally towards more easily arrangements that more easily lead to the dispossession of peasants, but at the same time there is this effort by Europeans to constantly to try to marginalize the local Christian and Jewish moneylenders, and to take over their business, and eventually to enter the credit market, specifically the agricultural credit market, in a dominant position, which is something that they try to do for decades, and not very successfully. So, hope that answers.
My question is for David. I was wondering to what extent because you were talking about the same-sex desire, intergenerational desire, but we also know that in the 19th century we do have childhood labor as well. So how does that reconfiguration of the notion of childhood complicate the picture that you are trying to depict for us?
The question of childhood is a very, very interesting question that I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about, and also discussing in class with my students, because how it's difficult for them to wrap their minds around this idea that somehow we can distinguish between this sort of relationship between an older man or an older woman and the boy beloved on the one hand, and pedophilia on the other hand. Like that's something that I've sort of struggled to convey and to explain. And the best way so far that I've come up with, and I think that will also go towards answering your question a little bit, is that the age period in which a young person can qualify as a boy beloved, in one sense, I mean, if you're a boy beloved, you're a gender unto yourself, right? You're neither a man nor a woman. You are a sexualized being, but you're kind of your own category. And the age in which you sort of are supposed to step out of that role is like when your beard starts growing, right? Again, there is no sort of like, as you were saying earlier, there's like no specific cutting off age where they say at 18 you're no longer that, but it depends on physical characteristics. But going back, I noticed that probably the way that they distinguish between a child and someone who can be a boy beloved is not based on physical characteristic, but it's actually based on a certain mental maturity. Because in these stories, when you see older men or older women picking and choosing people to fill the role of the boy beloved, you notice that they're not just looking at beauty, but they're actually looking at a sort of accomplishment. They're looking at a certain education. Can they hold a refined conversation? Do they know Arabic and Persian? Can they play one or two instruments? Do they know calligraphy? Do they know how to sit down? Do they know how to eat? These kinds of things. So they're looking actually for like the distinguishing factor between childhood and the age in which you can be a mahbub or a boy beloved is actually more determined by your mental sort of state than by. So I've argued. I mean, of course, I can't conclusively back this up with sources, but I've argued that probably to an Ottoman older gentleman who has boy beloveds, being together with somebody who did not have that mental maturity would have seemed abnormal in a similar way in which we regard pedophilia today. And so what I argue is that childhood, the definition of childhood is very different, because childhood is a protected realm. Childhood as a realm in which the innocence, the disconnect between a person's concerns and sort of the world is maintained. Is not really something that we find in that sense in the Ottoman sort of in this. When I say the Ottoman Empire, you understand. I mean this sort of refined, this sort of urban environment, right? I mean, children from the earliest age imaginable are exposed to sexual discourses such as in Karagöz, etc., etc. They're exposed to discourses of violence and so on and so forth. So that the maturation sort of just happens through this exposure, and there is no real sort of effort to preserve of this this kind of innocent realm of childhood. So you mature into somebody who could be a boy beloved much earlier than might be assumed nowadays, if you think about that kind of thing. And I would argue that in the 19th century, what sort of enters the discourse is not just new ideas about, okay, intergenerational desire is not good, same-sex desire is not good, and so on and so forth, but also these new notions of childhood. Childhood as a realm that needs to be protected, that needs to be preserved. Childhood as a sort of time in life that is extended, right? That is sort of artificially, if you will, extended, and sort of people are kept in it for a much longer period of time. And that further complicates this idea of who can be the object of desire, and so on and so forth. So ideas of childhood next to ideas of sort of sexual desire and who that desire can be applied to are I think very, very important to getting the full picture of this sort of landscape of desire.
I have a question for Aviv Deri. I understand you focused on the non-Muslim money lenders. At the same time, were there also Muslim money lenders, or was it prohibited because of some form of through Quran or Sharia? Or were they a significant group?
Okay, thank you for this question. It's one of the most, I think, popular, maybe, themes that have been dealt with in this, credit in general, and on the Ottoman Empire and Muslim societies in general. And I think, there is this more, I was going to say classical view that talks about the limitations in Islamic law on Muslims, and interest specifically is seen as a very problematic trait. But and we still have that in today's scholarship, people like Timur Kuran, and others who are still holding this view. But we know that it was, we have by now many studies that have shown that, in fact, there were a variety of ways and mechanisms on the local level that existed in which Muslims were heavily involved. And in fact, so first of all, tax farming in general, which was a huge thing in not only in the Ottoman Empire, right, in Muslim empires and others, is in some ways is also, involves indirect. It's a form of indirect government borrowing, right? So, and in these fields of investment, of course, Muslim elites, and specifically in Damascus, were the dominant business families, the dominant households, and this is one. This is maybe one part of it, and another is also in direct transactions that we see a lot of them in the Sijil, and there were many ways to bypass the formal limitations in the law on interest, and they were employed very extensively by Muslims and non-Muslims. And I think one of the things that I found mostly interesting in this area that I'm focusing on, and the hinterland of Damascus, was that it was, I think it was this dominant position of the Muslim elites By the way, they were also dealing with money lending to peasants. Of course, it was a very common business among Muslims as well. But again, I can't get into it. But there were so many ways of, soap, for instance, was a very big thing. Using soap to the creditors would sell soap in a certain amount as interest, right? To not use it officially as interest transaction. So this is just one example among many. But I think that what was interesting for me is that the Christian and Jewish families that were so important in this area as moneylenders, they were very, I would say even obsessed in this period, right? Because grain was so important and so profitable. They were very obsessed with becoming more and more involved in tax farming and in having some kind of more control over revenue. This is what was interesting for them, and this is what they wanted to get the most. And they were constantly, I think, there was very fierce competition with the Muslim families in this area, and all kinds of government limitations on that as well that they managed to bypass in various ways. Some were illegal. They would hide their European status sometimes and lie about it, and then it was only later found out by the Ottomans, or all kinds of ways in which they sought, interest to this business. But yes, I think it was from a position of relative inferiority that they managed to become powerful, and not otherwise, and not the other way around. I mean, because it was the Muslims that really dominated the credit market and land market in this area.
I think we have time for maybe one more brief question, unless, Leslie, do you have anything you want to ask? No? Okay.
I have lots of questions.
Oh, okay. So that'll be for coffee hour. If anyone else has a question, now's the time. Otherwise, we can break for our coffee 30 minutes. Okay.